Hey. All right. Good morning. I want to thank our panelists for participating in this roundtable discussion that we've entitled An Overview of Public-Private Partnerships for Water Supply and Treatment. We've assembled a range of experts on these partnerships and the projects involved, and I look forward to learning from the extensive experience each of these panelists has. This is the third event of the panel on public-private partnerships, which Chairman Schuster and Ranking Member Rahal announced and asked me and Mr. Capuano to head up. And today we will focus on the role that such partnerships, the public-private partnerships, can play in maintaining and improving our water and wastewater systems. I've said many times when I chaired the Water Resources and Environment Subcommittee that there's nothing that people take for granted in this country like we do our water. We all understand the essential nature of our water systems for sustaining public health and supporting economic growth and protecting the environment, but it doesn't get the recognition in the public, I think, as much as probably it should. Our country's water infrastructure is immense. For example, there are 600,000 miles of sanitation sewers, 200,000 miles of storm sewers, and 100,000 pumping stations. However, much of this infrastructure is aging and deteriorating and in need of repair, replacement, and upgrading. Traditionally, states and localities have relied on the municipal bond market and the federal Clean Water State Revolving Fund program for capital investments in their water systems. Despite these substantial federal and state investments in infrastructure, still much more investment is needed to address all of the demands that communities face. As a result, many are seeking new ways to increase funding for water infrastructure. Public-private partnerships are one new way to advance needed capital investments in water projects. Many municipalities and water providers now contract with the private sector to find ways to right-size their operations and gain efficiencies in their existing systems. Some localities have gone even further by entering into long-term concessionaire agreements for the private sector to upgrade, operate, and maintain their systems over a long-term contract. We will hear about these projects today. We'll explore how public benefits can be protected under such agreements, which is especially important when concerning water systems, a basic service essential to all of us. I read just a few years ago that you could put every family of four in the state of Texas and give them 3 acres of land each and leave the whole rest of the country totally empty. You just can't look at a map on one page in a small book and comprehend how huge this country is and how much open space there is. But having said that, people say they want land around them, but they really don't. They want to be near the malls and the restaurants and the movie theaters. And so people continue to move out of the small towns and the rural areas and move in or close to our urban areas. That creates even more demands on our infrastructure, and we need to consider how to handle that, not only how to upgrade and improve, but we also, many of these systems are having demands now that they've never had before. Today we will hear from the Honorable Deborah Robertson, the Mayor of Rialto, California, Dan Sugarman, Vice President of United Water, Sandra Sullivan, President-elect of the National Council of Public-Private Partnerships, Bruce Toby, partner of Pannone, Lopes, Devereaux, and West, and Mitch Jones, Program Director of Food and Water Watch. And we certainly appreciate all of you being here with us, and I'll now turn to the Ranking Member, Mr. Capuano.
You don't really need that. Do we really need that?
Okay, well, thank you. Good morning. First off, I would just love to say thank you for inviting me to come to Washington, D.C. Could have picked a sunnier day, but nonetheless, I do appreciate having the opportunity to come before the committee and speak about public-private partnership. And Honorable Capano? Well, okay. I hope as we have this conversation, you will probably get from me some of the same things that you've said about why do we need to do this public-private partnership, or why do we need to focus on the infrastructure. And it's not just about, for me, it's not just about today's activity or my presence, but the fact that I have two generations that live in Rialto with me as well, my daughter and my granddaughter, and all of us are invested in the community. So I know that I'm trying to address things that will be resolved today so that they will have a better opportunity and not have to deal with those items that, unfortunately, for various reasons, previous councils elected not to go on and address. So now, no longer kicking the can down the road, we have to start dealing with it. And you showed us that pipe. I love that. I mean, but I'll say when I bought my first home in Rialto back in 1990, one day I discovered water puddling up in the middle of the living room, only to discover that I had, without a layman's term, a cesspool. The pipe underneath the house had eroded, but every time you looked in there, you saw what appeared to be a perfectly good pipe, but the bottom had fell out. And so you had all this water that was accumulating under the house, and I had to jackhammer the slab and deal just with something like what you've seen where it finally had corroded. So anyway, that's why, it's time for us to address what is under the ground, because in our community, as is everyone's community, oftentimes, as long as you turn the faucet, the water comes out, and they can get the water and it's not necessarily brown, what's the problem? They really do not understand that it's time to address a problem. But in Rialto, we were able to finally discuss with people and bring to them the fact that if you go to turn on the water, it's not just about the reliability for drinking it, but it's also about the reliability for public safety. And in the course of our conversation, hopefully, we can get into that. But let me give you just a little bit background about the community of Rialto. As you see up on the screen, there's kind of a nice map that shows you where we're located. We're basically in San Bernardino County, east of Los Angeles County, or east of Los Angeles. Most people seem to know that's a point of reference for them. We're a population of just over 100,000. Median household income is about $52,000 a year based on census data for 2010. And we have an operating budget for our general fund of just about $59 million a year. Our major employer in Rialto is the school district, warehousing, distribution, and some manufacturing services. We service in Rialto the Rialto Utility Authority, which we'll talk about, and what we formed basically services about 50,000 of our residents for its water, and we service the whole entire community as it relates to the waste treatment facility. And the budget for that, or revenue that's generated from that, basically in 2014 was about $37 million. Why did Rialto basically undertake this? Well, it was like everyone else in their community. We had just come through recessions. We had a lot of unfunded liabilities. Rising costs were ahead of us. Even some cities around us, as you probably have heard, have experienced or had to look at bankruptcies. But more importantly, we also had a very aging infrastructure. And as I said earlier, we had previous councils had put off a lot of stuff in terms of needing to improve our infrastructure. Our systems were over 60, 70 years old. Rialto is over 100 years old, community. We celebrated our centennial. And then we also had a lot of our expertise, for whatever that expertise was, maybe not really versed on new technology. They were beginning to retire as well. We needed to cut the budgets, really didn't have a lot of options in 08 and 09 when a lot of the cities were being forced with the recessions and having to cut and scale back a lot. And then we were high unemployment as well. We needed to figure out how could you create some jobs, job consideration. But the activity and the way we went about pursuing this wasn't because we were just looking for job opportunities or dealing with the other thing that happened in California, and that was a big, huge unfunded liability because we also were dealing with pensions for public employees. So we looked at it, we realized that we needed to address a capital program in the city of Rialto, and we needed to address it to the tune of about a 5-year capital program, which was about $41 million in capital improvements that needed to be made. And I have some of the numbers here, and if you don't mind, when you said you want to get really into the details, well, I happen to have a person with me who is our finance director, and that's all he does is eat, sleep, and chew on numbers. He confused me over my oatmeal this morning. So I'm going to be looking to him right behind now, let him do all of the explanations because he really gets excited about trying to explain that. I do exactly what you do. I end up going to sleep trying to keep up with it. But basically, the bottom line for us was the public-private partnership, and what was unique about Rialto was we started out with a group of people who came, partners, and they were able to show, along with our independent engineering analysis, what the needs were. We assessed and inventory what were the capital needs, what things we needed to get accomplished in the city of Rialto. And then we also went out looking for the public-private partnerships. In the beginning, I was very skeptical. To the point, I didn't want to pursue anything that was exclusive. I certainly didn't want to give away the house jewels. If you talk about the mortgage, they started off at first with wanting to have us sell our assets, and that would be part of the public-private partnership. Well, fortunately, the majority of the council, we weren't in favor of that. So we worked on coming up with what became a professional, I'll say, management or operating agreement. And in that, we also said to him, I wanted you to go out and work arrangement with labor because Rialto is a very blue-collar, middle-class community. And I wanted to see if they could go and work out an arrangement with organized labor for a project labor agreement. Much to my surprise, they did. And so from that, we had a commitment that as we go forward and get the work accomplished, and it's going to generate over 400+ jobs over a 5-year period, the people who will be working and doing the jobs will be those very members that are in Rialto. Now, what else is unique about the public-private partnership with Rialto is that 85% of the funding is on the traditional municipal bond sides, and George can further explain that. And 15% comes from what you'd call the private equity side. Of that, 11% is provided by ULICO. Some of you may be familiar with ULICO, and basically ULICO is the pension fund for the organized labor side, similar to like California has CalPERS. What became very beneficial about that in the arrangement was it became a win-win for everyone. In the course of the next 5 years, the jobs as it's rolled out, primarily in the trade side, there'll be some laborers, but it's really in the trade side. We're talking about pipe fitters. We're talking about operating engineers. The members will be the ones going out to actually do the work. The ones in Rialto, if they're not already dispatched, they have first preference. But more importantly, when they're working, they're also paying back into their pension fund. And their pension fund is what's helping to invest this. So it's in our sense, a win-win. I always keep saying it's the new version of mom and apple pie, because it's really good when you find out that you are actually helping your funds or helping to invest back into America, as opposed to oftentimes investments going abroad somewhere, but actually helping to invest back into our community and make sure that there's some jobs generated. And we, the council, myself and the council, we have to hold our partners in our agreement their feet to the fire to deliver that capital program within 5 years. If we would have stayed on our own traditional path, we would have delivered the capital program roughly in about 15 years. The benefit, the trade-off, and George and I, we talk about it all the time, is we're bringing the benefit of having an improved system to the community and to the future generations so that they can benefit on it earlier, sooner than later. So you start looking at what's the trade-offs. You've got efficiency in the system. You've got reliability in the system. You have a professional organization that's going to be managing and operating your system for the next 30 years. So you can always look to them to go out and know what's the greatest and best out there on the market. And also, you know, you're not, from a city's perspective, when we're trying to manage budgets, we're not having to incur the cost and the debt of having new employees, additional employees brought on. One of the things we also arranged in this arrangement was that our existing employees who work for us in public works, underwater, and wastewater, they were transferred in the agreement to the concession, to the partnership, to the public-private partnership. And they were transferred with the understanding that they would have guaranteed employment for 36 months. First it was 18 months, but we said no, 36 months should give a person enough time of job security to be able to assure themselves that they could transition to the company and not have a concern about their own livelihood or their employment opportunities for the future. It also gives them an opportunity to pursue greater and further certifications and move in advancement of technology as technology becomes available. So those are kind of the story about the community of Rialto, and I'll stop here and either take questions or move it on to...
Very good. We'll get to questions later, but when you said 36 months job security, the thought that crossed my mind was we just get 24 months in this in our elections.
Yeah.
Mr. Sugarman.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to participate in the roundtable today, and I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the company where I've been an employee for 25 years, United Water, and then try to put the transaction that we closed in Bayonne in December of 2012 into a broader water market context. I'll just start by saying that there are some really strong similarities between the transaction in Rialto and the one in Bayonne, both in size and kind of in structure. But I'll just start a little bit with United Water. Company's been around since the late 1800s, and for the last several years, we've been the number one, number two, or number three private operator of water and wastewater infrastructure around the country, as measured by revenue. We serve between 5.5 million and 6 million people, and we treat about 1 billion gallons of water and 1 billion gallons of wastewater every day. The company employs about 2,350 people. We manage about $3.2 billion of water and wastewater infrastructure, and we operate in 21 states with what we like to describe as two major segments of our business. So one of those segments is what we refer to as the regulated utilities segment, where we both own and operate the assets, the system assets. And the other segment is what we refer to as our contract operations segment, where we don't own the assets, but we operate the assets for a governmental client under typically a long-term contract. So in the context of those two segments, we have 16 regulated utilities, and we have about 90 contracts with municipalities around the country. Of course, when I say regulated, in the context of regulated utilities, I really mean in economic terms, where we're under the jurisdiction of a state public utility commission. And of course, everything we do is really regulated in one way or another. I would say in particular environmental regulation compliance, usually at several levels of government. So historically, where we own the assets and tariffs are regulated by a state PUC, we raise the capital that's needed ourselves. We go to the capital markets and we raise the money that's needed for infrastructure. But in the contract operations segment of our business, the capital needs, I would say, have typically been financed by our governmental client. So from United Water's perspective, the transaction that we did in Bayonne, which is really what I was asked to focus on today, is something of a hybrid between our regulated utility segment and our contract services segment, in that the legal ownership of the assets remains with a governmental entity, but we're providing capital. And to address Representative Capuano's concerns, we are providing capital both up front and through the term of the agreement. So it's a continue to invest. And in this case, the Bayonne agreement is a 40-year term. So in a way, we would see this as a contractual version of the structure that we have under a state PUC. Okay, some differences there. The rates are not set by the PUC. The rates are controlled by the local government and the contract. And we don't take ownership of the assets. We don't take legal ownership. But many, many other aspects of this project are sort of a contractual version of how we operate under a public utility commission. So in Bayonne, to provide the capital, we partnered with Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, or KKR, which manages about $80 billion in assets under a bunch of different kinds of funds. The one that we're dealing with is one of their infrastructure funds, and it has some focus on the water sector. Bayonne is a city with a population of about 63,000. It's situated near Newark and New York City. And it happens to be near or adjacent to several other systems that United Water owns and or operates, and that helps us achieve some economies of scale. Current and prospective key economic themes for the city include its development as a port. It has a medical center. It has some manufacturing and distribution activity. And so we view its economic outlook positively, in part because of the proximity to New York City. But I wouldn't really describe it as an affluent community. It's just like many, many communities where we have water, wastewater operations around the country. It's just a normal place. So about 17 years ago, the city of Bayonne created a municipal utilities authority, an MUA, which before our transaction closed had responsibility for operating and maintaining the city's water and wastewater system, as well as responsibility for the capital funding of those systems. And as we entered into our agreement with the Bayonne MUA, it had about 12,000 customers, 33 employees, and it was heavily leveraged. It was really deeply in debt for a system of this size. And it also had, much as we just heard, it had really significant infrastructure challenges ahead because of deferred investment in that infrastructure. And it had last raised rates in 2011. Under the concession agreement that we have with Bayonne, the joint venture between United Water and KKR made an initial payment to the Bayonne MUA of $150 million. And that was used to eliminate the MUA's existing debt. So it's taking the debt off of the MUA's books, and I would say there was also a contingent liability on the city of Bayonne's books. And some of the money was also used to make some initial capital improvements that were necessary from our perspective right out of the gate. The joint venture has also committed to funding at least $107 million, and that's in today's dollars. The investment actually is indexed to inflation, so it escalates over the 40 years into the system over the life of the contract. And I would say it's also important to note that within 3 months of closing this transaction, Moody's improved Bayonne's credit outlook. And that's not just on the MUA. It improved the city's credit outlook. And in doing so, it attributed part of that improved outlook to this transaction. So the Bayonne MUA continues to maintain ownership of the water and wastewater system, will provide oversight of the concession to monitor our performance, quality standards, health and safety criteria. And in addition, ultimately, the MUA maintains control of rates charged to the users, although I would say that the rates are largely guided by a formulaic approach under the agreement. So United Water will operate the system under the joint venture for the 40-year term and in an operations and maintenance agreement. And what's kind of unique about this approach or business model is that it required working through a variety of complex institutional barriers, to kind of create a blend of United Water's operating expertise along with a long-term plan for capital investment through the relationship with KKR. Of course, the approach has been used in the transportation sector and extensively in other countries, so it's really only innovative insofar as it applies to water and here in the U.S. I think it would be a little presumptuous to say that the project is a total success, since we are only into it, a year. It's a 40-year deal, and we're a little over a year. But after 1 year, we've already made many capital improvements to the infrastructure that had been long neglected before we were involved. And we've also provided employees with training that they never had before. And out of the gate, I mentioned that some of the capital that we've deployed was in the upfront payment. And out of the gate, most of the early capital improvements and the training we provided to employees were heavily weighted towards improving employee safety. There were a variety of safety issues. We did a safety audit in our due diligence, and we were very uncomfortable with some things that the employees faced. So in addition to that, though, we've already put in place the backbone infrastructure for a wireless water metering system and a whole bunch of other monitoring systems, which is what we use routinely to run utilities and water, wastewater infrastructure in other locations. And if I were to sort of kind of net all of that out, what we're going to be able to do with these systems is help reduce water loss from leakage, so reduce wasted water. We're going to be able to prioritize replacement of the underground infrastructure, much like the pipe you showed. And we also can improve operational efficiency. In a way, I would say that, before we were involved, these employees had a handsaw to do what they needed to do. And United Water is able to provide them with a compound miter saw. Okay. So we see that many cities face challenges like the one that we're addressing in Bayonne, and those cities would benefit from investments in infrastructure that lead to improved service reliability and water quality. And I don't really have, I'll say, an ideological bent towards private capital versus public capital. But in Bayonne, they had access to public capital for 15 years that the MUA was in existence, and it didn't get done. Okay, so we're bringing private capital, and we are improving the infrastructure. And those are my remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Sullivan.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan, Mr. Capuano, and members of the panel. I, too, am very pleased to be here today, and I thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to join you to explore this timely issue, and it is really about options for today that will provide for a sustainable and a stable future. So it isn't just a conversation about what we can do today to solve today's problem, but it truly is a conversation about the future. I don't have to tell you that as members of this body, there is immense pressure on governments at all levels to do more with less. State and local governments in particular continue to feel pressure in trying to provide public services while saving public taxpayer money. This makes public-private partnerships more important than ever. Savings through efficiencies and performance management brought by P3s can go a long way towards addressing the critical financial needs that are facing our cities today. But first, I think it's important to note what P3s are and what they are not. They're a unique, innovative way to maintain public ownership and public control of public services. Most P3s are not the same, P3s are not the same as privatization, and most do not include a transfer of assets. Dan explained the regulated utility business, and there are a wide variety of options that are available under the P3 banner. Partnerships require public governance, and they combine the strengths, skills, and knowledge of local employees and companies that specialize in operations, engineering, technology, and customer service. And by doing so, the mission's not only to just meet the compliance requirements, but also to meet the public service expectations. And P3s do so at a savings to ratepayers. I'm proud to serve as President-elect of the National Council for Public-Private Partnerships, and we've been around for 30 years, and we're the leading nonprofit, nonpartisan education association focused on P3s. P3s are probably the newest old thing or the oldest new thing. The first one that I know of was in 1972 in Burlingame, California, and that is still in existence today. The public and private sector members of NCPPP work towards innovative solutions to deliver public services in a wide range of areas. Now, regarding water specifically, I'm sure you know, you're familiar with the sector's services that we can provide, be it water and wastewater, collection, distribution, pump stations, billing and collection, biosolids. And the discussion today centered on P3 options for water is of critical importance. And why do I say that? Because a report issued by the American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that an investment of $298 billion is needed in capital investments for the nation's wastewater and stormwater systems over the next 20 years. Aging infrastructure, water mains and pipes, as you clearly showed us, are over 100 years old and result in about 240,000 water main breaks each year. And this tough winter that we've had has shown testimony to that, and that number actually may be higher. The massive water loss that results from broken pipes and leaking pipes is something that needs to be addressed so that we can take care of a critical resource that is water. And that's where the public and private partnership comes in. The private sector is really anxious and willing and poised to assist in this manner through different options in P3s. And it's time to bring water infrastructure, jobs, and the economy into the same conversation, and that's where the private sector is really poised to help. Many municipalities can manage these issues, but by teaming with private sector partners that specialize in these areas, like United Water and Veolia, we are able to share the risk and provide better services so local tax revenue is available for other services such as infrastructure investment, public safety, public health, and education. And turning to the private sector for assistance is not an indictment of the public operation. In fact, some of the best-run systems in the United States, in New York City, right here in D.C. at D.C. Water, have turned to the private sector for performance management strategies, innovation, and technological advances. Municipalities realize that P3 innovations can help them better reduce costs, address maintenance issues, comply with environmental and regulatory requirements, and have access to certified staff. It really serves as an example that if you're responsible for one system and you turn to a partner that perhaps has 1,000 systems, that knowledge and those best case practices can bring to bear a lot of efficiencies. It's really looking outside of your own operation, not that your operation is flawed in any way, but to look for further efficiencies. Veolia, for example, has a contract with the City of New York, DEP, and we've identified and implemented initiatives that will save $65 million each year, with projections for a total savings of between $108 and $130 million by 2016. And New York has an expression that they use, and it's the best can do better. And that's an excellent example of why they reached out to the private sector so that together we can look for efficiencies. We work side by side with municipal employees, all of the public sector employees, state public sector. Veolia provides 4 or 5 management personnel, and we really work alongside the public sector employees to teach them efficiencies we know, learn from them, and take that knowledge out into the field. The overwhelming number of municipalities that enter into water project P3s realize these benefits and choose to renew their partnerships when they expire. Public Works Financing Magazine reported a retention rate of 90 to 97% for the majority of water projects in the country in a 2012 report. And that's just one of the signs that P3s work. Hundreds of communities deliver their water services through public-private partnerships. My colleague here today, Dan Sugarman, and I represent service to more than 600 communities throughout the United States just by our two companies alone. And I'm proud of the colleagues on the panel. Dan and Bruce Toby are also members and active with NCPPP. They serve on our Water Institute, which spends a great deal of time focused on this very issue and is a great resource for those interested in how we can find more innovative approaches to water services. I have the chance to work with Mayor Deborah Robertson, who told you in a very humble way about her Rialto experience, but it really is a mayor who went boldly forward with an innovative plan that brought public and private expertise together to solve a pressing municipal challenge. And I look forward to hearing Mr. Jones' perspective as well. I appreciate your invitation to participate today, and I look forward to the discussion and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Toby.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Capuano, members of the panel. There is no more of a delightful way to begin a day than to reunite with Mr. Capuano. And yet, I will note that this is a reunion. I'm retired. But I will tell you that it's also a reunion, Mr. Chairman, for me with you. Just about 13 years ago to the day, I had the privilege of testifying then as a mayor on behalf of the National League of Cities on the water infrastructure financing gap. And 13 years later, we're still here, happily wrestling with the same issue and looking for ways to keep things intact and to keep things going. And generally in the spirit through which local services, I would argue, are always provided, which is neither partisan nor ideological, but rather about making things work. Now, I've provided written testimony, and through that, I've run through just about everything I'm going to say today that's turgid. There's only a little bit of turgid left. I've talked about the outlines of P3 models and some of the legal considerations, background on their use in this country. And happily, I've been supplemented by the three panelists before me on a lot of that info. So I'd rather work some new ground, and that would come in three parts. I'd like to talk a little bit about the evolution of this sector since I first set my toe in the drinking water and wastewater world back in 1982, and the challenges as well. I'd like to talk about a couple of examples I've seen whereby local service providers have tried to thread some of the needles that you all are concerned about as you do this study. And then third, a little bit on turgid specifics, just a little. First, on the notion of evolution. As a municipal general counsel coming into a world that included providing water and wastewater services in Gloucester, Massachusetts, I saw in 1982 a community that treated these services just as another department. That's the priority it got. That's the focus it received. In those, and I was only 5 years old then, in all those years, what I have further seen occur is that there's been an enormous change, and it's continuing and it's permeating local service providers in these sectors, I think at every level, from the small to the large. And that is moving from that just another department mode to that of a much more sophisticated private sector business model. And there are a lot of factors that drive that. First of all, staffing levels have had to, by raw necessity, become vastly more professional. Every level, up and down the hierarchical table. But as well, the emphasis on training has been absolutely enormous in its growth. It's had to be, with drinking water standards, with wastewater treatment standards becoming ever more complex, and the treatment systems that engage them doing the same thing. IT utilization exploding, and to good end, so that measurement and achievement of performance standards is absolutely critical in the modern utility of the 21st century. And then last but not least, best practices, and key among them, which speaks to how assets are taken care of and hard-earned monies that are invested in them don't go to waste, considerations like asset management programs, which are finally putting a real hard accent mark on doing the right thing to preserve publicly owned assets. The challenges continue. One of them is scarce aging staff. There was a time, as you all know, back in the late 70s, early 80s, when this was a good field to go into as a wastewater drinking plant operator. And getting the licenses was a worthwhile investment for a long-term career. And for some reason, that slice of life, those folks have sort of moved along, and there's no one coming along after them. That's a challenge, especially for smaller and mid-sized utilities. Secondly, the financial issues, while still large, have changed to look somewhat different. When we talked 13 years ago, it seems like yesterday, we were talking about a financial gap, and that was the real focus. Well, the focus is still there, but the manner of engaging that gap, has changed, because the big part of it has been debt. And now, and I cite this in my testimony, a recent survey shows that over 25% of utility budgets is attributed to debt service. There's lots of ways to borrow money out there. Well, that may be the problem, frankly. It's certainly less the solution than it used to be. I would argue all these considerations will be increasingly drivers for increased use of public-private partnerships going forward. Now, I said I was going to thread a couple of needles. We've heard, on the first one, we've heard conversation already on the Bayonne and the Rialto concession arrangements, those long-term deals that have been described to you in some degree of detail. There's a third one, and it's an interesting hybrid. It was achieved through the same kind of very transparent, very participatory, in a public sense, request for proposals process that yielded the Bayonne and the Rialto contracts. This one occurred in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Same kind of models, same kinds of goals, but an interesting thing happened. It's very much a hybrid. The successful proposer was another public sector entity, so that the city of Allentown assigned its assets and the responsibilities for their operation, maintenance, and renewal to the Lehigh Valley Regional Authority. So there are hybrids here. There's innovation. There's possibility so that public-private can also yield public-public. But the same degrees of accountability, and with that I foreshadow the turgid, are built in. We'll come back to that. There's a lot of concern in this sector, and it's understandable, and this is the second threading of a needle, especially in the drinking water side. These are precious, publicly owned resources. Do you give them away? And do you give them away to companies that sometimes aren't even U.S. flag companies in their ultimate ownership? After I was done as mayor, I don't know if Mr. Capuano knows this, I bumped my head on the way out the door and decided I'd, a few years later, become a city councilor. I'm done with that experiment. 8 years was enough. But I will tell you that one of the things we did that I'm very proud of was, because these concerns were felt very strongly in Gloucester among our population, we went to the legislature, we petitioned to amend our local constitution, our charter, and built in a provision with the assent of the legislature and the governor, whereby long-term shifts of ownership, be it lease, that's a shift of ownership, or outright title conveyance, can only occur with our water assets if there's a referendum with 2/3 of those voting yes. So the controls can be put in to protect the vital public interest that I know we're all concerned about. Now to the turgid, and I'll really be quick. When you think about it, there are lots of examples, and some actually going back to my part of the country with a lot of years under their belt now. When the Boston Harbor cleanup was going forward, for example, what do you do with all that sludge that's no longer being discharged into Boston Harbor? Well, you contract in a public-private partnership with something called New England Fertilizer Company, which comes in, builds, operates the facility that pelletizes them, finds markets, and makes them go away to beneficial reuse. By the way, that captures something that's increasingly part of the utility of the future. The utility of the future is having to engage market opportunities, and that's a great example. What do you do with biosolids? Do you generate power? Do you find other beneficial uses? Do you generate, by the way, a revenue stream? That is very much a driver for private sector involvement. Public sector hasn't really wrapped its arms, I would argue respectfully, around making profit and then managing it into the revenue stream of the overall utility. But a key is understanding that what you've got here, if you've got a well-done public-private partnership, is a complex, very thorough series of contractual documents. And I would commend to the committee and to the panel and to its staff a review of Allentown, Bayonne, Rialto, and those contract documents, because you're going to see they set binding standards closely established for measurement purposes, guarantees, planning obligations, bilateral, by the way, with lots of consultation. These utilities in the public side don't just push it off and walk away. There's an engagement here. That partnership thing is real. It has to be, or these don't work. They talk about maintenance, management, replacement. They do serious capital planning with executions built in, funded, insured. And they closely govern rates. There are built-in standards that are fundamental to these matters going forward, or else you just find the failure of the past where political will isn't always what it needs to be, and the rate increases aren't in place to get the work done that needs to get done. Where's the money go? It goes to debt defeasance right up front. It goes to O&M. It goes to capital replacement. It goes to reserves. Critical funding pools and reutilizations that make sure that the program's going to work. So in closing, again, I say thank you. I hope I wasn't too turgid, and I would simply reiterate, this isn't partisan, it's not ideological, and it's not the silver bullet. It's a tool. It can make a difference. It's not for everyone.
Well, thank you very much. Very interesting. Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member Capuano. I feel like I need to begin by saying now for something completely different. As Ms. Sullivan suggested, I'm going to give a slightly different perspective on public-private partnerships than what you've heard from the other panelists today. Let me begin by telling you just a little bit about Food and Water Watch, the organization with whom I work. Food and Water Watch is a consumer advocacy organization. We were founded a mere 8 years ago, and we haven't quite reached United Water's 21 states that we operate in, but we do operate in 15 with 17 offices nationwide. And we just opened one in Baltimore last week, which means I had to commute down here today from my new office in Baltimore. Lovely weather for that experience. But what we do is we advocate for public access to safe and affordable food and water. And so one of the first issues that we began to work on when we were founded was funding for water infrastructure. And we have worked with many members of this committee, including you, Chairman Duncan, when we were first founded, on trying to come up with a funding solution for the SRFs, which I know is not what we're here to talk about today, but if I could just make one point on that before I move on. You mentioned in your statement earlier about the increasing suburbanization and urbanization of the populace and the kind of the depopulation of our rural areas. I would just suggest that, especially for those communities, the real solution there is going to be a combination of renewed SRF funding, which I know is not the responsibility of the members of this committee, combined with public-public partnerships, which I'll also touch on a moment later. In terms of public-private partnerships, our criticism is really based on 4 points, which I'll mention quickly and then give some details. The first is that really this is a more expensive form of financing, not funding, but financing water infrastructure than is public financing. And there are a variety of reasons for that, which I'll go into. Second, although we hear a lot about risk transfer in these deals, because of the way that the contracts are written with the rate structure in particular, there is a limited amount of risk transfer that takes place in these deals, especially in these concession contracts. Second, independent studies have shown that there really is no evidence for the claims that there are real efficiencies in the private operation of wastewater and drinking water systems. And then finally, we would argue that there is a loss of transparency and public control, or at least real public participation in these deals. So to begin with, 90% of the drinking and wastewater investments in this country come from the public sector, and that's mostly through tax-exempt municipal bonds. Most city utilities can readily issue low-cost tax-exempt muni bonds or general obligation bonds. And in 2012, 97% of U.S. municipal water and sewer utilities had a credit rating from Standard & Poor's of A or higher. of A or higher, meaning that they could get fairly good rates on their debt. And the problem at hand with these public utilities is that, one, they don't want to raise rates. It's not politically attractive to any local office holder to have to raise water rates. And two, there has, quite frankly, been a decrease in funding coming out to capitalize the SRFs. So from our perspective, what we face is a public water utility funding problem, not really a financing problem. And if you were to look for a financing solution that could address the funding problem, that could only be the case if it actually lowers the costs for the municipality. We argue that private financing is significantly more expensive than government borrowing. Last year in 2013, according to the Bond Buyers Index, the 20-year general obligation bonds had an average general interest of 4.26%. It's 4.26%. And revenue bonds had an average interest rate of 4.77%. Private financing tends to run close to twice as high. On the low range, it's about 7.5%, and it can run 14% or higher. If you look at the Rialto deal, the concessionaire's weighted cost of capital was expected to be about 8.6%, including a 19.6% pre-tax return on equity. The existing public debt in Rialto had a weighted cost of 3.8%. Private financing, as the other panelists have suggested, especially in these concessionaire deals, is a great way for a locality that's looking to pay off other debts, whether they're associated with the wastewater and drinking water system or not, by getting an upfront cash payment and often yearly payments as well. But while this takes debt off the city books, what it in effect does is transfers it to ratepayers' water taps. So the city doesn't have to increase taxes, but the ratepayers are still going to be paying. So it's a wonderful means of moving that debt off the city books and onto the consumers, onto the ratepayers. It makes really no fiscal sense, no financial sense, we would say, for the typical city to enter into a public-private partnership that's financed in this way because of these facts. In Bayonne, as Mr. Sugarman mentioned, the MUA was deeply in debt, and in 2012, actually, it had a net asset value of negative $10 million. So its assets were negative $10 million. This is because in 1997, when the city created the MUA, it leased it, and then it sold it to the MUA. So the city leased and then sold to the MUA, the water and wastewater system, to raise $23.5 million to plug a budget deficit. Then in 2001, the city leased its aqueduct to the authority, or its aqueduct authority, for another $28 million to plug general city budget deficits. In other words, Bayonne already has a history of doing this with its water system and with its aqueduct, of basically monetizing the system to plug other debts. If you want to know why Bayonne was deeply in debt, it's because they were already being fiscally irresponsible with these systems. And they've turned around again to do this with this deal. When Nassau County in New York was looking at doing a similar deal to the deal in Bayonne, their interim finance authority director, George Marlin, actually claimed that it was a crazy idea, that it was a little bit like using your 15% Visa card to pay off your 4% mortgage, and recommended that Nassau County not follow through on a similar deal. So we believe, for those reasons and others, that these deals are not financially responsible. They are more expensive. The capital, while it's not being paid for by the city, is being financed at the tap. In a sense, it's a tax through the tap. But the city books, it never shows up on the city books, but the ratepayers, the voters, the consumers, end up having to pay it through scheduled rate increases. And those scheduled rate increases are one of the reasons why we argue that there's a limited risk transfer involved in these deals. Concession contracts like the ones in Rialto and Bayonne often allow the concessionaire to pass on all or most of the major financial risks to consumers. the concessionaire returns are practically guaranteed in these contracts. And there are very complicated formulae in these deals that account for these increases. In the Bayonne deal, for instance, there's something, they call them the revenue requirement adjustment events. There are 13 different types of revenue and requirement adjustment events that can lead to an increase in rates. After the rate freeze, there is a temporary rate freeze. Once that is over, and in fact, the end of the rate freeze is one of the events that triggers an adjustment to the rate. There are, in the Rialto wastewater deal, service fees for wastewater chemical components to reflect actual expenses along with there being escalators for labor and routine maintenance and other adjustments to compensation. So the rate packages that are in the contracts, one, are written in formula that when I read it, I'm glad that we have a PhD mathematician on our staff because they're complicated, very complicated. And this goes to my, what was going to be my fourth point, but I'll move it up, which is that there's a lack of transparency. And part of that is because these contracts are so complicated, so complicated that in many cities, staff is not going to be able, they have transaction costs because they have to hire expertise to try to understand the contract that they're negotiating because they don't have anybody on staff who can understand them. How can we expect the ratepayers? How can we expect the voters? How can we expect the public to understand these if their government officials can't even understand them? In terms of efficiency gains, there was a report done by Mildred Warner, who is a professor of city and regional planning at Cornell, that found that there is no significant or statistical difference in the efficiency between public and private provision of water and sewer services. Some reasons for this include that monopoly service with a captive customer base for an essential service, and there's no possibility of substitution. So these are monopolies. These are monopolies. Once you get the contract, you have monopoly. Two, there's really a lack of competition because the only competition is for contracts. And in a case where the contract is 20, 30, 40 years, there's not much real competition going. You would have to reduce these to 2 to 5 years for there to really be any sense of competition in the contracts, a real sense that you might lose this contract if you don't perform effectively, and you have to make efficiency gains in order to do that. And then again, there are high transaction costs between the water and wastewater systems. So concessions are complicated, they're expensive to set up, they involve planning and decision-making, negotiations, arbitration arrangement, and contract supervision. There was a study that was done of this that found that transaction costs can range to 2 to 10% of the total project cost in concession agreements, 2 to 10%. And in Rialto, the legal and other transaction costs amounted to $11.2 million. I've already touched on the loss of public accountability and transparency, but I would just highlight again the bit about the contracts and the rate increases. We're told that rates remain, because it's a regulated utility, with the public. But again, in these contracts, if you go in and look, it is a formula that's put in place in the contract that really controls the rates. And so while there's a nominal public control of the rates under these deals, it is really only nominal. Once the contract is in place, there are kickers. There are automatic rate increases over certain years. So those are the points that we have, and thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Jones. Very interesting. In fact, I'm anxious to hear some of the responses, but I always since I will be here to the end, I yield my time to my members. And Mr. Perry was here, I believe, before anybody. So I'm going to go first to Mr. Perry and then Mr. Capuano.
Me first? All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start with Mr. Jones. I listened to your discussion with great interest, but I got to tell you a couple glaring things. I mean, sure, the concession might be 20 or 30 years, but what's the difference if the municipality owns it infinitum? Is it not yet still a monopoly, and aren't the captors or the captives of paying the rates still under the same yoke to a certain extent? So I find that somewhat specious, as well as funding and financing. I mean, and I struggle with this with members of the committee. I mean, yeah, you call it financing, some people call it funding, but when it's my money and or the private industry's money and they're financing it, they're essentially funding it because the government can't or won't. So I'm going to quit pontificating and try and get to a couple questions here. In the issue of Bayonne showed itself to be, according to you, irresponsible, right? So they pursued other means to fill the holes and so on and so forth. So what would your answer be if not P3s? And what's the Damocles sword that makes the administration of the city of Bayonne do the right thing?
I'm not sure what the Damocles sword would be that would force them to do the right thing. We, in general, advocate for, well, on the one hand, they could have gone and attempted to get revenue on from the general bond market, the revenue bond market, municipal bond market. In terms of their seeming incapacity to control their own budget deficits, I don't think that this is a solution to that either.
Okay, well,
any more than anything else would be.
Well, so this isn't a solution, but you can't beat something with nothing. You have nothing, so what are you offering?
Nothing. They can get loans through the state from the SRF. They can go and get.
But that doesn't fix the mismanagement of the system where the people that you're advocating more want clean water and a useful sewer system. It doesn't change any of that, the fact that they mismanaged that, squandered the money, can't maintain the system, and they still have to provide the service. It doesn't fix any of that.
And I would argue that bringing in this concession deal doesn't fix the problem of the fact that the city appears to be badly managed.
But it does fix the water and sewer situation, so at least you got part of the problem fixed. I would agree with you on the other end. Okay.
It may, but at an expense.
Can I move on with you, Mr. Jones? Just out of curiosity, where are you on public sector unionization of the workforce? Let's say the city still maintains the system and they have a collective bargaining agreement. Where are you on that?
I think it's a wonderful thing if the city still has the bargaining unit involved in working for the system, so long as that is, in some sense, a guaranteed provision.
Okay, all right, I get your answer.
I mean, yeah.
Mr. Tobey and Ms. Sullivan, just curious a little bit on your discussion about foreign ownership. And you take a company like American that was a family-owned enterprise, big enterprise, and was bought by RWE. And if they had concessions in the meantime, when they were an American company and then sold to a German company, is there something to be concerned with there? What should people care? What should people do? What should municipalities do to guard against that? Should they be concerned against guarding against that, et cetera?
I have often said that when you look at the companies operating in this sector, you need a scorecard, and it plays out over time. It changes so much. There's no doubt about that. It is not a static corporate setting. I think in the final analysis, when a community or a local utility is trying to analyze, looking across the table at these guys, whether or not they want to do business, it's not about where the corporate headquarters is ultimately located. It's about doing the due diligence on the management team that's going to be assigned to your utility, on the management team that oversees their operations, on the commitment of the parent to the corporate guarantees, because there needs to be a substantial backstop on these arrangements. It's not about flag. It's about the meat of the deal.
Okay. Have a comment?
I agree with Mr. Tobey, and I think that I'm not that I don't want to be flippant and say it doesn't matter, but for the company that I work for, in addition to being president-elect of NCCCC, it's a company that is a foreign-owned company that has been in the water business for over 150 years. So there's expertise.
Sure.
We're a U.S.-based company. We're listed on the New York Stock Exchange. When I just did my tax return, I didn't send any of it overseas. So you're welcome. So I understand the point, but I don't I don't see the difference.
Okay, thank you. Just,
Could I add one more thought, Mr. Perry? I'll be quick, very quick. I worked, after I was mayor, with a regulated utility based in the Northeast, owned by a British parent. And in one of the strangest interactions of my life, found myself doing due diligence touring of no less than West Point, which the British couldn't take from us by force, but it was on the market. It was on the market, and the U.S. government was inviting the potential of the ownership.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Capuano.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I generally yield my time, but I have to go to another hearing on the national debt, which is kind of my little problem. I want to start out my comments by commenting that when I was mayor, I privatized trash collection in my city, which at the time was a big deal. It's a heavily unionized city, and it was difficult to do, and I did many of the same things. My employees were transferred to other positions, and they turned out to be okay. I say that because, again, I really have heard very little here to tell me that what this is all about is really about political unwillingness to do what's necessary. Mr. Perry, you just said to do the right thing. I think that's a fair way to put it, because as a former city councilor, as a mayor, as a congressman, none of us like raising taxes. And by the way, I want to be real clear. As far as I'm concerned, tolls and fees, either that we collect or empower others to collect, are also taxes. Whenever the government takes action that allows anyone to reach in someone's pocket, that's a tax. So my water bill is a tax, though it doesn't go, actually, in Massachusetts, what we did, and Bruce knows this better than I do, at least in Boston, we have 60 communities that effectively are now the Allentown, Lehigh Valley type of thing, 60 communities in the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority. And let's be honest, we did it because the state and the local communities that were doing it before the NWRA was created didn't have the courage to increase water bills. My water bill was approximately $300 a year. That's water and sewer. My water bill and sewer bill right now is approximately $1,500 to $1,800 a year. The MWRA raised those rates dramatically to pay for the right thing. So the real reason we did this is it was a consolidation and it was a economy of scale type of thing, but it was also a lack of political courage. Let's be honest, what this really is, and it doesn't necessarily mean your political courage or mine, it's usually what you've inherited. You walk into a situation and 15 mayors, 15 governors before you have screwed it all up because they haven't had the courage to do what they needed to do. You're stuck in a situation, oh my God, I got this debt, I got all this other stuff, I got to do something. On all these private deals, let me ask a question. Are they usually based on private activity bonds, or is this a different format of no private activity bonds on water? Okay. They are on the highway side. Private activity bonds seem to be the major way to fund this. Since they are slowly going out the door, I think that's an important thing. I guess when everything's said and done, the way I see this is there is a price to be paid for the lack of proper and appropriate political leadership in the past. And the price is profit to private companies. And so the question is whether we, and I think, Ms. Perry, I think you actually asked the best question. How do we get people to do the right thing now so we don't have to get into this situation? And again, not the philosophical thing where the government, just to take care of water, sewer, schools, highways, all the other things. It's easier to do highways because you can see them, but water and sewer I think is the toughest because you can't see them. And I don't know the answer to that, except on some ways to let it collapse. I would expect that your situation, were you already mayor then?
No,
It probably got you kind of angry, and you probably wanted to call somebody at City Hall.
You know what? Actually, and I appreciate I know what Ms. Sullivan said. No, I wasn't mayor. I've been mayor now. It's a little over, I'd say, a year and a half, going into a year and a half. But I've been on council since 2000. I was a part of coming on council at a time when we first started with the first 30, 40-year arrangement that I thought, being a novice at this, coming into government. I mean, not being, prior to that, being fully engaged in government, where I was born and raised in San Diego, California. But having before me in the first year a discussion of, one, the city was in a deficit. We were teetering near bankruptcy in 2000. But we also had to look at how could we restructure ourselves. And one of the things we did then was to create a Rialto Utility Authority, where we took those assets and we created a JPA and we started making structural arrangements. That created a 40-year arrangement that I thought, oh my God.
Were they being funded out of the general fund prior to that?
It moved it away from the general fund and structured it as as an enterprise itself. Then we roll into this year. Now, one of the things I'd like to say about doing the right thing. And as I said earlier, when prior councils had kicked the can down the road, had to put it off. No one likes to deal with taxes or rate increases. But it finally, it come home to rest. And the council, we were looking at this model, but we are also looking at the reality that if we went with privatizing or a public-private partnership, or if we stayed on the normal course, we had to raise rates. And it was time for us to raise rates to the tune of almost 111%. So we went out and we educated the community on the fact that we had not raised the rates. They had not raised them, they had deferred it, and therefore deferred the maintenance. So the public went out and they voted, and in California you have Prop 218 where you have to do a protest vote if you're not in agreement. The rates were going to be raised regardless if we entered into the concession agreement or not. So that was one thing that our community had to come to grips with, that, we had put it off long enough, things were going to collapse. I hate to say it, but we had examples over in Los Angeles of an aging infrastructure, and, you could be driving down the street one day on a nice dry day, and all of a sudden you've got a sinkhole or you've got something collapsing, and that's because of the pipe system. So the community supported the rate increase. It brought about, in the course of the concession arrangement, some level of reliability, because at least we are not going to have to go back to the citizens and do another rate increase every other year. It's over for 5 years.
Take that rate increase ability, put it into a formula, give it to a private company that if you don't like it, you're stuck with the formula. And let's be honest, I can't think of a single mayor or city manager who didn't protest the MWRA's rate increases while they were raising them 100% a year. We all did. And we all went out there and protested. And by the way, we also gave them the authority to dig up streets without contacting the city beforehand. We did all kinds of things that basically said, we've screwed up for 100 years. And by the way, 150 years is great. We've been doing water in Boston for 250 years, and we didn't get it right. So sometimes experience is not necessarily the wonderful thing. Now, getting to be a senior member of Congress, I think seniority is fine. No. That's a different situation. So I would really like to see some of the numbers behind some of these things when you get a chance. I mean, this isn't the place.
Yes.
But I'd like to see, what you got up front, what you're generating now, what did happen to your rates. That's the first comment today, which I know the answer. I didn't know when it was going to come. But I knew the rates have to go up.
Yeah, rates
There's
have to go
no
up
other way
regardless.
to do this. The
Right,
question is,
right.
how much did they go up? And to me,
Yeah.
if rates are going up, any fool can fix anything if they have enough money. And that's a secondary item. So, Mr. Jones, I think Mr. Perry asked a fair question. I have my hesitance about P3s, and I don't even expect an answer because it's the same thing I'm struggling with. If we're not going to do this, which I see as really a way to focus on a few infrastructure problems, water and sewer, whatever it might be, and to say the country, or enough people haven't been doing the right thing, so we have to empower somebody to encourage them to force them to do the right thing, or to allow them to end run the inability to get it done. I need to find an alternative to this. How do I get, other than simply, publicly chastising, the mayor of Podunk and saying, this mayor of Podunk hasn't fixed your water and sewer, and it collapsed in my living room, which obviously is, I actually enjoy doing that, but I have a hard time finding all the people who are responsible.
Well, and not only that, it sounds like we're pitching if there's a negative and there's a dark side to the public-private partnerships and there's a good side on the municipal side. I think we have to start moving into some other alternatives and be open to exploring other options. You mentioned just now, you said your comment when you were mayor, you privatized waste management. I mean, as long as I'm mayor, at least till 2016, I'm looking for other opportunities as well. So I'm going to continue to monitor and be very much engaged with this, but I'm also beginning to look at other opportunities. Waste management is another area, but looking at it more in a regional perspective. Currently, our operator is Burtech Industries, but we need to start looking at possibly another major transfer facility. Also, the other thing that I look at is someone commented earlier that, it was a good profession to go into way back when, and people used to get their certifications and they could see a career for 25 years. Well, now you still need to create jobs and reasons for your youth and your young adults to want to come back to your community and give back. So you may need to start thinking about taking the technology, revamping it, and looking at opportunities with the private sector and with things that you're doing and revamping it. How many of the young minds around here right now want to come back and work in solid waste or work in trash? Probably not. But if they are going to college and they're moving in the direction of green technology or environmental engineering, and you've got a lot of things going on in your community, such as we have in Rialto, in addition to the need to deal with the infrastructure, we also just got finished dealing with almost 13 years of a lawsuit for dealing with wastewater contamination due to chloric in our water. We have a big Superfund project now that we will be there. They will be cleaning up in our community for 40 years. Some of the people that are behind me, we will be meeting with people today and tomorrow because I'm looking to create opportunities, not just for a job, but opportunities for people to go away to college, get a degree, and come back to the community, into the industry that's going to be there 40 years.
I get all that, but at the same time, I don't want to do it. I don't want anybody to be able to do it just for today and find out the next generation has nothing to look to do.
Right.
They're completely stuck at the bottom, at the whim of a private company, which in private companies, there's nothing wrong with it, but let's be serious. Private companies exist for one purpose and one purpose only. That's to make money. God bless them. That's the way it should be. It's America. It's capitalism. That's a good thing.
You're right.
Government doesn't necessarily do that. There's a balance between doing the right thing and making and actually encouraging people to be efficient. And that's a tough balance to find. So for me, that's what I'm struggling with this entire P3. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Capuano. Mr. Rice.
Thank you, sir. Well, I hear Mr. Jones saying that there aren't any efficiencies. I hear Mrs. Sullivan say there are efficiencies. I think it is a financing mechanism. Question is, does it cost, you guys have to make a profit, you don't want to do it. What kind of return, Mr. Sugarman, do you look at? What kind of return do you need to enter into one of these agreements?
Maybe just a couple, can I answer a couple of points here, and then I'll come back to your question. So I agree with much of what Mr. Jones said about the history in Bayonne, about how they got themselves into the deep debt. And I would also agree that, and this is to your point, Representative Rice, our cost of capital is higher. And it's not really obvious to a company like United Water why our cost of debt should be higher. Okay, so why is it that we don't have as ready access to essentially the federal subsidy that is tax-exempt debt? Okay, and I know that there's legislation in movement to address some of that in the form of WIFIA. So maybe to come back on a couple of other points, though, there are efficiencies in what we're doing. And in fact, we would view our higher cost of capital as a handicap, something we have to overcome in order to bring value in other ways in order to overcome our higher cost of capital.
Well, I can see really immediately two ways that costs go up when you get involved. One is your return.
Right.
And one is your higher cost of capital, right?
Right.
Two ways.
Well, higher cost of capital.
What I need to know is, what is the return that you're looking for?
Sure. Okay, so in this Bayonne transaction, the return that we're looking for is very similar to what public utility commissions allow us in our regulated business. I said this was kind of a contractual version. So the project at the project company level, okay, is capitalized in a way that's quite similar to our regulated business, which is to say 35% equity and 65% debt. We had to go to we went to the private debt markets, private placement debt, and the cost of the debt, largely because of the credit rating that we were able to obtain on it, was comparable to the cost of debt that, okay, and that's taxable debt. It was comparable to the tax-exempt debt, the rate on the tax-exempt debt that was in place in Bayonne. I would say that that was a bit of an anomaly of the current market conditions, okay? And that's because currently taxable debt, tax-exempt debt for this kind of a term is comparable, it's similar. If Bayonne had not been in, I would say, had a credit quality problem, okay, they should have been able to refinance their debt, okay? And they would have been able to obtain a lower rate. So I'm going to give you some order of magnitude, okay? Weighted average cost of their debt that was in place that we have defeased was on the order of magnitude about 5%. That's because it was old, okay? So they issued it in a higher interest rate market. Cost of the debt we brought in because we had somewhat better than investment grade, okay, was in the same neighborhood, okay? That's not to say, I don't disagree with the point, though, that Mr. Jones made earlier. Our overall cost of capital is higher in part because we have the equity component, whereas municipality would be funding in
But
part.
forgetting about the cost of capital, just forget about that.
Okay, so I can speak to the efficiencies, all right?
No, I don't want you to talk about efficiency. I want to know what return that you are looking for before you'll get into one of these deals. What profit does
Yeah,
your
the
company-
profit that we're looking for on the equity piece, that's where we make a profit, would be lower double digit return on the equity component.
So 10 to 15%.
Yes,
Okay.
right. And that's comparable to what public utility commissions are allowing on the equity component of our,
And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to vilify you in any way, but
Right.
it's just math. I mean, if
yeah, okay, so,
there's an extra 10 to 15% cost there,
yep.
and then the cost of capital is higher, then somebody's got to pay that cost.
Okay, so-
I assume it's going to be the user. Now,
Yeah.
those costs are going to be offset by efficiencies, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Sullivan.
That's it, you're not going to let me finish on the efficiencies?
No. I'm
Oh,
gonna let
that's
Mrs.
me.
Sullivan answer that. I got to ask everybody. Mrs. Sullivan, you said efficiencies and performance management. Those are the words you used. Tell me about those. What are those, and do they offset that 10 to 15% return on investment, and do they offset that higher capital cost?
They,
So in other words, when you take that, the
Yep.
additional cost and the additional savings, is the consumer paying more or less? That's what I'm trying to get to.
okay, in many situations, they do. The
They do
the
what?
efficiencies based on
Okay.
the operations of the facility for the 30-year period of time. So in other words, you have the financial transaction, and then you have the operation of the facility over a 30-year period of time, and the efficiencies from that, it changes from facility to facility, but the percentage of efficiency savings oftentimes can offset the higher cost. I'm not going to tell you that I can give you numbers here today, but I would be happy to follow up
I
and
want
provide
numbers
you.
here today.
Then the efficiencies that I was speaking about in New York City, for example, is a different type of public-private partnership where the company worked alongside the City of New York DEP. We did first we do a complete review based on performance measurements, metrics, going out into the field, looking at procurement, customer service, technology, and then we identify the savings, and then during the implementation phase, that is where the company's return comes in. So in New York City, so far, we have helped them implement $65 million annualized savings based on the peer performance review that we've helped them conduct.
Okay, just give me can you give me any, not numbers, but specifics of how those savings are achieved?
The savings are achieved through, there's such a wide variety of things.
Just one or
In the
two.
plant, it could be power costs on a plant. It could be
So
the purchasing.
the private entity pays less for power than the government?
Pays less for power because the facilities run more efficiently. It is often the experience that when you go into a publicly operated facility that has not been perhaps trained in the use of efficient power use, that things are running full tilt all the time.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Mr. DeFazio.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I think the gentleman has followed a really good line of questioning here, and I'm trying to work it out too. I mean, I'll start with Rialto. I assume that a major factor was the cost of CalPERS. Is that a major factor?
Cost of capital?
No,
I'm sorry.
CalPERS.
Oh,
CalPERS
CalPERS.
driving,
Oh,
yes,
yes.
right? You were trying to get out from under
Well,
CalPERS for these
CalPERS
employees.
Not just for the employees. CalPERS was one of the issues that had brought an impact to us, not from the
Sure.
employees that were in the wastewater.
But I mean, the overall, I know
Yeah, in the
cities are
over-
being
in the
killed by
cities, yes.
CalPERS, right? So, but I mean, the question, okay, so what is the program for future rate increases? You did the one big rate increase. How are future rate increases set? What
Well,
are they programmed?
when we did the rate increases that we put in place this one time, it is rate increases that will happen over a 5-year period.
So
there's
the
roughly-
110% is
is
over
spread over a
5 years.
5-year period, and within that 5-year period, basically is that we also expect to have the majority of the capital improvement program delivered within that 5-year period, so that beyond that 5-year period, then we will look to see that we should envision efficiencies, and we should be able to continue, if needed, to have rate increases only based on whatever this
Right.
CPI
I'm just struggling a little here because I live in a city where we bought out a private water system because it was so poorly maintained, and you know, we hired good engineers, we hired people who were competent, and you know, there's no thought of going back to a private system. So, I mean, in part with Bayonne, we're dealing with essentially a totally incompetent local government, at least from what we've heard here. So it made it an easier, you know, I mean.
Historically.
Yeah, historically, okay. But I mean, so I'm just trying to figure out, you know, where this works and where it doesn't. And it's something we're struggling with. I mean, I've always said, gee, I've got big problems on the surface side because unless we're going to toll the interstate and the 160,000 bridges that need significant repair or replacement, you know, and transit PPPs don't work at all because all transit systems lose money, except maybe the one in Hong Kong. So I say, well, it's not going to work real well there. It will work well on a limited way. And the last panel we had said maybe 10 to 12% of our surface problems could be solved through PPPs, and that was a PPP advocate. So, but I always said, well, gee, I think in water and wastewater this can work a lot better. But I got to say, after today, I'm more skeptical because I'm just not getting the specifics I need to hear. If your capital costs more, except in this case because you had a city that must have junk bond status, you know, so you came out somewhat equivalent. But for a city that has a good rating and can access, you know, municipal bonds, the capital is going to cost more. You need to add on your 12 or 14% rate of return. So that means you've got to capture, you know, at 15 to 20% efficiency. Now, I understand if you take the employees who were paid at, you know, probably their salaries are going to go down, their benefits are going to be diminished and all that. I don't know how much you can save. You still want to hire competent engineers. You still want to hire competent techs. So they can't go down all that much because you got to compete for good people. So I'm trying to figure out, except in the example you gave, which is, well, these people were so dumb they didn't, you know, they ran things to the point where they were wearing them out and were using more power. And I mean, these are incompetent people. And I mean, it isn't that easy.
No.
So I'm trying to get at, if we're approaching this with cities that are well-run, that have good public works departments, that hire competent engineers, that do all these things, I'm trying to understand where the advantage is going to come from, and is there really one or not? And that's what I'm trying to get at, and I'm having trouble dealing with that. So, Mr. Sugar.
Well, I was just going to say, first off, you know, and I think for every situation, every situation or community is going to be different, and it's going to work for different places. For Rialto, I think beyond the fact of, you know, I think the staff was competent. I mean, the expertise, I said in the beginning, though, we were losing staff because they had been with us a while, so they were coming to periods of retirement. Then you're losing not only the staff, you're losing the institutional knowledge. We need to bring that in, but also more importantly, as we're moving in our community, we're looking to do, you know, have government, but smaller government, but bring about greater efficiency. So
Right.
I'm not necessarily always looking.
Some length to Mike about your objectives, but I want to get to some specifics. Mr. Sugarman, do you want to give me some specifics?
Yeah, I can give you some specifics. So I mentioned that in Bayonne, before we took over operations, they had 33 employees running the system. And we had an obligation to keep all 33 employees through the first year. And now we're running the system with 19 employees.
So basically you had sort of political patronage.
And I'm not so sure I would say that. That's a little too pejorative. Okay, I'm going to say that what we're able to do is put in automation Okay? And by using automation, that's one of the elements.
But they had no incentive to put in automation.
They did not have the same capability to put in automation, going back to the hands-off.
Right. See, here's what I'm trying to get at here, is I would like to get an answer from you that we got from the Surface panel, which is, it seems to me we're dealing here with a level of incompetence in certain cities and accidents of history and a whole lot of other things. I would like to know, given, what is out there in the universe in terms of well-run systems versus not so well-run systems, state-of-the-art systems, what, as a substitute for federal financing, what % of the problem, can PPPs take care of? I mean, is it 15%, 20%? I mean, we got very low teens from total advocates on Surface. I'm wondering what it is here. It may be a higher number.
Yeah, okay. Well, the first thing I would say is that, there are 52,000 community water systems, very fragmented industry, but there's an 80-20 rule, right, which is to say that, 80% of the service is provided by 20% large cities and 20% is the, okay, so you can look to the EPA's information on this. Most of the problems are actually in the medium-sized to smaller cities. Okay, the big cities tend to have the infrastructure. I'm not going to, Sandy, I'm sorry.
Well, New York still has wooden water mains.
You can still get better in the big cities too, but the big cities really have the ability to hire, the competent people to get access to capital markets and to put in the kinds of systems to automation.
Right. Okay, but I'm still, again, I'm trying to figure out. See, the way we used to do this is the federal government was a great partner. We built our metropolitan wastewater system with an 80% match, okay?
Right.
So now we have to, and we have capitalized the needed improvements all along by charging higher rates, and it was a little bit unfair because people were paying higher taxes and higher rates to capitalize the replacement of the system. But that's the way we did it when I was a county commissioner, and it's going to work out over 100 years, however long we got to do it. So, but the question is, if we're not going to have, and Mr. Tobey previously testified, and I believe I was here with Chairman Duncan because I was ranking, on the need for federal funding. I just don't want to come out of this saying, well, gee, the PPPs can substitute for what the feds used to do totally, and everybody will be fine.
Yeah, we would not advocate for that. We would say it's part of a portfolio of solutions.
Right, and that's what I'm trying to get at here. I'm not denigrating the PPPs. I'm just saying that it's not going to solve our problem. I'm trying to get sort of a percentage. I was able to get that out of Surface. If you guys could say PPPs could do 25%, 20?
Sure.
Okay.
I'll say
that good?
I'll say that, sure.
Okay.
I want to say one thing, Mr. DeFazio, I'd want to change the mood a little bit, at least in one regard. It's not just about cleaning up problems in the past, mopping up after bad mayors, but there's opportunity looking ahead in new fields where the utilities don't have foundations and experience to do what needs to be done. Great example, taking biosolids, waste material, and turning them into fuel, turning them into power.
We're doing that, fuel and fertilizer with our...
Well, absolutely, but it's getting really more complex. You're dealing with proprietary technology, and it's a sideline. And, by the way, it'll spin off revenues that can help offset rate increases. So there's opportunity here in a niche way, because this isn't for everything. It's not for total systems everywhere.
Right.
I think we could do more, and it would help.
Right, okay. But, I mean, that's sort of where I wanted to get to, is that, I mean, you're part of the solution, but we can't say, gee, now we don't have to worry about it from a federal level anymore.
I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's...
Can I just say one more thing about efficiency? Okay.
Sure.
Right, so, or maybe two. Okay, one, those employees that are not part of the 19, we found work for them in our other systems. Okay, so it wasn't like we just, fired them. Okay, we found work for them in our adjacent system. The other point I'd like to make on efficiency is that our client, the BMUA, was required to do a value for money analysis on this whole transaction. And they were required to do that by one of the 3 state agencies that had review or approval over this transaction. And you can find their value for money analysis in interrogatories with the Public Utility Commission. Okay, that was one of them weighing in. They don't have jurisdiction 40 years into the future, but at the outset of the transaction, they have to give approval. Okay, and in their value for money analysis, it's not us, it's the BMUA giving this to the state. They said that this transaction would save them $35 million on a net present value basis, which comprises about 6%. Okay, so that's their view on it. So we not only did we overcome, right, our higher cost of capital, right, through a variety of efficiencies and some innovative thinking.
And a particular basket case example, but
yes.
All
But
right, yeah.
I'm going to say, so is there exactly a silver bullet in this transaction? Right. There might be a couple of little things, but that's part of what we do. We go and we try to find the silver bullet, whatever the difference is in the service op, where, okay? Yeah. So that it's, there are a whole pile of assumptions that go into that value for money analysis, but they're their assumptions, not ours. So.
Sure. Okay.
And remember, if I could just add one other thing that I didn't get to comment on, was I said earlier that our community is serviced by 3 water agencies. And so even with what we've accomplished with the public-private partnership for the Rialto area and put in the rate increases, again, looking around and the other remaining water areas that are servicing, our rates are still relatively lower than the other 2 water agencies. So the community has to recognize at some point that it's very hard to deliver a system and make the necessary improvements and then also work to keep your rates down. So it's one of those other elements that...
We only hope that they have water to send to your system this year.
Yes, well, we've been assured we have enough, we have some in the basins that'll allow us to manage to get through 2 years.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just...
Sure, go right ahead.
I would point out on the efficiencies front, again, there is another place that you can look if you're interested in looking at a study, and that is that Fort Worth, Texas, just last year, looked at whether or not it wanted to establish, it looked at a whole host of different options for P3's privatization of its water systems, and actually included comparing continued public management of the system as one of the options in its study, which a lot of cities don't bother to do, by the way. A lot of cities leave that comparison out. And what they found is that it would be more expensive to privatize. I know some people don't like us to call it privatization, but to set up a P3 than it would be for them to do continue to run it publicly. And they decided late last year, just a few months ago, not to pursue a P3 in Fort Worth, because they looked specifically at these expenses and decided that it actually wouldn't be cheaper. And the other thing I'd just like to mention is, look, Food and Water Watch has actually worked, we worked in the city of Los Angeles a couple of years ago in favor of rate hikes because we recognize that sometimes rates have to go up. The question is the rate hike actually going to pay for the maintenance, operation, and improvement of the wastewater or drinking water system, or is a significant portion of that being siphoned off to pay for this private financing, which is frankly more expensive than the public financing options that are available, and that's the real concern and critique that we have. Yes, rate hikes are going to happen. Rates are going to go up. We have advocated for them. We've opposed some. We support some. It depends upon the situation. But the question is, what are the rates actually going to be used for? And are they going to be siphoned off in this way, or are they going to actually go into the system? And is it really just going to be a real direct, transparent tax, if you will, on the user, or is it this kind of hidden tax to pay for all of these other things which the private financing is paying for, which have little or nothing to do with the wastewater or drinking water system?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. DeFazio. Let me, as we've gotten closer to the lunch hour, we've lost all of our members, but I do have just. I'm going to bring this to a close pretty quickly because I've listened very intently to everything that you've said. But I would like a couple of responses and. Ms. Sullivan, I believe I heard you say that the first public-private partnership was 1972 in Burlingame, California. Is that correct? And what are your numbers now, and what's been happening, say, in the last 5 or 10 years? Is this something that's you see growing very fast, and also along with that, maybe Mr. Sugarman or Mr. Tobey can respond to this too. Mr. DeFazio mentioned that in his city, they went to a private company and then were unhappy with it. Or maybe Mr. Jones has information about this. How many times has that happened where cities have gone into these, or counties have gone into these partnerships and then stopped them or ended them? Anyway, so that's a bunch of questions in there.
As I had said earlier, between Dan's company and the company that I work for in my day job, we operate in about 600 communities. And we also have a significant industrial water operation where we operate for industrial clients throughout the United States. The public-private partnership it started as a contract operations, maintenance, and management business. It has evolved and is continuing to evolve into something that includes many more options. It can be a design, build, operate. It can be a concession. It can be the O&M model. It can be a peer performance review of the operations. And the efficiencies and the contractual relationships takes on many different forms. So it is still a viable option. I will say that I totally agree with Mr. Jones that it is not an option for every community. And that is a conclusion that we can draw ourselves. We have gone into communities, as I'm certain Dan Sugarman's company as well, where we've gone in and done our initial review, and we say, at the end of the day, you need to invest in your facility, and there are no efficiencies. It's going to cost you more money to go this route. And so that's something.
I know, but what I was getting at, though, you're here representing the National Association or the National Council.
That's correct.
And I'm just wondering, do you know how many public-private partnerships there are across the country, and has there been a fast growth in the last 5 years? What do you know about that?
I wouldn't say there's been a fast growth in the last 5 years. There has been a different model of growth over the last 5 years with a couple of significant projects. It is not a fast-moving industry. It has been since 1972. I can't tell you that the progress has grown in leaps and bounds. It is a steady progression of different models, and there are probably, how many nationally would you say, about 800 partnerships, public-private partnerships in water nationally. And
800?
About 800. We can share that information.
Out of the 52,000 systems, 800?
Yes.
How many members are there in your organization?
There are, our organization is not just water privatization. It is energy, real estate, technology.
Right.
Our member base is over 200 members.
Okay. Mayor Robertson, let me ask you this. And maybe your financial aid there would be better to respond to this, but you heard Mr. Jones quote that official from New York who said this is like taking or his deal that was proposed in New York was like taking a 15% credit card to pay off a 4% mortgage. What were the figures that you all looked at? And
yes, I'll let George respond to that.
all right, let him respond.
Go ahead, George. He's been in my ear giving me those numbers. So,
well, just like Mr.
You can go ahead and sit down there.
Thank you. Just like Mr. Jones explained, we did have outstanding debt that we had on a state revolving loan, about $3 million outstanding debt at the time of the deal. We did go to market with 85% of the total financing, and it priced at about 5.5%, 85% of it. And then we had private equity that was subordinate to that 85% of the debt that priced at the 19.6 that Mr. Jones explained or discussed, for a combined weighted average of just over 8%. Now, we weren't the average. So if you look at the average bond rating of above A, our deal priced at A minus. And so when we went to market on the 85%, we received a rate of 5.5% in a private placement world that was considered taxable debt. So it was pretty competitive, the 85%. When you look at the 15% of the equity they took on a little bit more risk. So they're subordinate to the 85%, as well as the private operators. Table Rock Capital was a partner, as well as Ulico, sorry. They are actually taking an active management role through this whole process. So for the additional rates that we're paying them, they are the managers of this entire system. They hold the operator accountable through the process, make sure that the capital projects go on as scheduled, as well as they're responsible for generating all of the disclosure documents for the bondholders, as well as the regular and very frequent reporting and meetings that they have with us every 2 weeks. And so that's part of, when you look at that 19.6% rate on the 15%, we're getting a lot of professional services with that.
Well, let me ask you this. How easy or how difficult would it be to get out of the deal if, say, 5 or 10 years from now, the city was unhappy? Like, for instance, what Mr. DeFazio mentioned, that his city has pulled out because they didn't feel they were getting proper maintenance of the facilities and so forth. Are you comfortable with?
Oh, absolutely. So if there's performance issues with the operator,
right,
the operators themselves are not a party to the financing structure. So the operators, if they are not doing a good job, then those the private managers, as you can say, that provided the equity 15% portion, they're responsible to replace that operator. But if we were dissatisfied with the private operator or with the private managers, then yes, we could seek refinancing of the whole structure and get out of the deal. But we would have to find capital to buy them out, basically, at the balance of whatever the outstanding debt is at the time.
Mr. Sugarman, you said your company's been around a real long time, as I understand it. Is that
right? Yes, that's right.
And in all that time, have you had many cities or counties pull out of deals that you entered into?
I would not say we have many. We have one very high-profile example. We entered into a public-private partnership with the city of Atlanta in the late 90s. Mm-hmm. And there were difficulties in the agreement, and it was mutually dissolved. Okay, mm-hmm. So we weren't kicked out.
Okay.
And I would say that the problems that we faced in Atlanta are problems that we are trying to address with this different business model. So in Atlanta, we had what we would call a plain O&M, or operation and maintenance contract. And from our perspective, we entered into that agreement expecting to be in it for 20 years. And what happened was the city stopped investing on the other side. Okay, so we did not have the responsibility for investing capital. The city continued to have that responsibility. And we did not have adequate protections in the agreement, again, from our perspective. Mm-hmm. And so when the city stops investing capital, our maintenance costs skyrocket. And so we had challenges in the city of Atlanta, and we mutually dissolved the agreement. But
well, I guess there's no such thing as a perfect company, and no. You wouldn't have been in business as long as you have if you had many cities or counties or customers pull out of deals, I suppose. You were chomping at the bit a while ago to talk about efficiencies, and you talked about reducing the number of employees and going more toward automation and so forth. Is there anything else that you wanted to say in that regard?
Well, one thing maybe to highlight is I don't really see a situation like the one we faced in Atlanta as so terrible. It shows that the model is flexible, so that when things don't work, right, there's something you can do about it. You can get out of the agreement. People are often focusing on the failure of a public-private partnership, but we have plenty of examples where infrastructure that has been managed and financed on the public sector side has failed. And I mean, probably the most pertinent example right now is Detroit. So, who does that hurt? right? So in the case of Detroit, you have, it's a big fight right now, but is it the the unions that are looking for their pensions? Is it the the community that is faced with a system that isn't functioning well and all kinds of costs that may end up on that community? I would say in the case of a failure of a public-private partnership, certainly the community that's in it may suffer some, but the investors and the company is also going to bear, we certainly did in Atlanta, is going to bear a part of that kind of failure.
Well, I've got to get to a luncheon meeting too, but I want to give Mr. Jones the last word. But I want to see, Mr. Tobey, do you have anything you wish to add? You mentioned the Allentown situation, but you didn't really give much detail. But I don't want to limit you to that. Is there anything that you want to add to what you've heard or said here today?
I'm a happy camper, Mr. Chairman. I will get the, I do have the contract documents for Allentown, though, and if it'd be helpful, I can get them to your staff. An interesting deal, very interesting deal that captured a whole lot of public
Okay.
issues.
Whenever I get around anybody from Massachusetts, I can't resist telling them that Johnny Pesky was a longtime friend of mine. I don't know if you know who Johnny Pesky was. Very fine man. In fact, I have a picture of him on my credenza, an unusual picture in his street clothes, standing at the Pesky pole, and a picture that he sent to me. He's had me right in the dugout at Fenway Park. But anyway, that's Mr. Jones. Let me ask you this.
Sure.
You talked about the rates having to go up and so forth. I talked about the movement in the country. It's it's all over the country pretty much. I mean, there's exceptions to everything, but mostly people are moving from the high tax states to the low tax states. They're moving out of the high tax, and they're moving out of some of the bigger cities in the Northeast, and they're moving. And you see Detroit and places like that. And so you've got these older cities that people are moving out of, but they've got this really old, problem-plagued infrastructure. And then also you've got people moving out of the small towns, rural areas, unless they circle a popular urban area. So people are moving out of those areas. They need more money, but you can't get it when you got people moving out, and that usually leaves a lower income population who can't move.
Right.
So what do you do to fund all these needs that are out there when you've got those kinds of movements going on all over the country?
Well, again, I know it wasn't the focus of this panel, but we at Food and Water Watch have worked for our entire existence on creating a trust fund for the SRFs with a dedicated funding source, so that there is not modeled exactly on the Highway Trust Fund.
Right.
Our version of it anyway wouldn't be, but something with a dedicated revenue source. We've worked with your office.
Yeah, I like that idea.
Lumenauer.
I always have liked that idea.
Now the problem is, of course, nobody ever wants to pick a funding source.
Yeah.
But we chose a tax on this as our suggestion. But that's one thing to really get more capitalization out into those state SRFs. In addition, we would recommend that Congress go back and renew the Build America bonds, which we thought was a very successful program that brought affordable funding option to a variety of municipalities. And we did some work with some folks to try to preserve those, and unfortunately, they're not available anymore, and we would recommend that that's a source as well. We recommend public-to-public partnerships. There is, as I mentioned earlier, I live in Baltimore. There is a consortium of Baltimore and its surrounding counties that has a purchasing cooperative.
I have to tell you, when you talked about commuting down from Baltimore, I thought about Mayor Robertson, who's come all the way from California.
I know. Well, I used to do it every day.
I guess what I'm getting at with this is, and I'm very much in favor of doing as much as we can about particularly the water infrastructure. Right. I mean, I'll tell you, I just like I said in my statement, people take it so much for granted, but I also understand. My dad told me many years ago about something. I don't remember what he was talking about. But he said everything looks easy from a distance.
Right.
But I can tell you, it's a difficult problem when you've got your income base in so many of these areas across the country is going down.
Right.
So it's difficult to come in and raise the taxes and the rates and all that at the time that that's happening. How many, do you have a lot of examples, or how many cities or counties have pulled out of these deals like Mr. DeFazio mentioned? Do you know? Or
The most recent figure I have is from 2007 to 2010, and it's a number that we calculated. There isn't, to the best of our knowledge, anybody who really does a solid tracking of this. But in that 3-year period, we found 18 local governments that withdrew from and remunicipalized their systems in one form or another, all across the country. I don't see any in Tennessee, but, you know, there were across the country. And what we've seen is that, you know, from our calculations, there's been kind of a steady, you know, I think Ms. Sullivan is correct. The industry is changing the way that it does contracts. And so we've seen a growth from basically none in the concession contracts. But that in general, it's kind of a steady, you know, there might be an increase one year, maybe a decrease, but there's not this skyrocketing move towards P3s across the country. I believe the figure that was put in front of me earlier was about 6% in drinking water and about 7% in wastewater.
all right. Well, all of us have to get on to other things, but you've been a great panel, and this has been for anybody who's stayed through it all, it's been a fascinating time, I think, and I certainly appreciate all the work and effort that all of you have put into this, and you've been very, very helpful and informative for us. Thank you very much. That will conclude.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Don't want to leave that behind.
Yeah, I was going to say, I thought you were.
Oh, sure. We're going to try to pick whatever.
Yeah.
I know if he has that ask. It's doable. I think
We need to like repeatedly ask people. They promise a lot of things.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. They think we're always focused on getting ready for the next hearing. Like we're trying to work on the international one now.
Yes, that is a problem.
Yeah, that is a problem. We're kind of
minor.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit.
Like the schedule is rather tight.
Yes.
Doing all these hearings. Yeah. And I've had budget hearings. I also I'm the budget committee. Yeah. So I've been meeting with agencies. I don't know what we've done next week. If I can remember this one.
Well, then we'll start doing budget on the
Yeah,
floor.
they're going to get ready for appropriations hearings.